Here we are in Abney Park Cemetery, an amazing site, local nature reserve, historically really significant burial ground, a London site of metropolitan importance for nature conservation, and a historically significant garden cemetery. And that's primarily what I'm going to be talking about today, because Abney Park was, when it was planted in 1839 and 1840, the most diverse arboretum on the planet. It was bigger than Kew Gardens at the time. It had one of every species in the famous Loddiges of Hackney Nursery. That's 2,500 different woody species, trees, shrubs and climbers, and another 1,000 varieties of rose. So today I'm going to be talking about the survivors, the Loddiges survivors. In other words, what's left from that original 1840 planting. We're standing at the front entrance to Abney Park. You can't really see because of all the wonderful trees, but behind me there are holly trees. These holly trees formed the initial avenue entrance to the cemetery. The design of Abney Park Cemetery followed some very visionary ideas of people like John Claudius Loudon, and George Collison was a major force in creating Abney, and the Loddiges tree nursery was used as the source for all the trees that got planted, or the vast majority of them, as far as we know. I'm in front of an unusual type of holly. So this is an 1840 planting. This tree would have been here when the cemetery opened in 1840. It was probably planted in 1839, and it's now a magnificent tree in a line of hollies. And the reason I'm picking out this particular holly is because this is a hedgehog holly. It's a cultivar which has long been known. It was probably first introduced in the 18th century, 1700s. And the reason why it's long been cultivated is because it has these curious leaves where the spines, as you know, holly has spiny leaves, but instead of the spines just being on the edges of the leaves, on a hedgehog holly, they actually occur on the upper side of the leaf as well. And so it looks like a little hedgehog. So this is hedgehog holly, Ilex aquifolium ferox, Ferox, a long cultivated form of the native holly. It's got flowers, so it provides pollen and nectar resources for wildlife as well. But it's a curiosity, one of those unusual cultivars that Loddiges planted. And that's what I'm talking about today. Those unusual, rare trees that survive at Abney because of that amazing planting from the 1840s. So here we are at another of Abney's great trees. This is a swamp cypress, again planted by Loddiges in 1840. This is a very unusual tree because it is a deciduous conifer. In other words, it's a conifer that loses its leaves during the autumn, and it's just putting on new leaf now. So whereas you might think most conifers are evergreen, swamp cypress, Taxodium distichum, is a deciduous conifer. The other commonly known deciduous conifer is larch. There's another one, the dawn redwood. So, swamp cypress, wonderful twisting, peeling bark. One of the great trees of Abney, one of the tallest trees on site. So if you saw an aerial photograph of Abney or a photograph taken of the canopy of Abney, this tree sticks out of the top, because like most conifers, it's a tall growing species, and it's probably getting on for 25 metres tall, this tree, whereas most of the trees on site are sort of 15 to 20 metres maximum. So this one pops its head out of the top. It's a wonderful example, and it's in really good health. So there's no reason to suppose that this won't go on for another 181 years. The reason we're doing this talk is to talk about the 181st anniversary of Abney and the 181st anniversary of the Arboretum. This was part of that original Arboretum. It's been here for 181 years, and it's got plenty of years to go. If you want to see this tree, it's dead easy to find. It's near the Church Street gate. Just look up when you come in from Church Street, and the tallest tree you can see is this one. Taxodium distichum, swamp cypress. It's from the kind of Mississippi Delta area of the United States, places like Louisiana. It lives in swamps, hence the name. And where it lives in water, where it's evolved, it puts up knees or pneumatophores, which are breathing snorkels to allow its roots to breathe. Because one of the things people forget about trees is that roots need air. So if you're growing in water, you've got a problem because the air in the water is difficult to access. So what swamp cypress does is it puts up little knees or growths that pop their heads above the water so that it can breathe, the roots can breathe air above the water. So, swamp cypress, one of the great trees of Abney. So this is a slightly unusual tree. It's a lime, common lime or small leaf lime. I can't actually remember which it is. The reason I'm here is because this is a lime coppice. So we'll look at the big sister of this tree in a moment. But the reason I wanted to focus on this is this shows you how a tree can survive even when it's been cut down. So this tree would have been cut down probably about 40 years ago. It may have fallen naturally, or it may have been cut down, but it's regrown, and you can see these enormous stems. There's 4 of them, 2 behind me and 2 next to me, and it's regrown as a cathedral. So when you in summer, if you look up into this tree, all you can see is lime leaves. You have to be a bit careful if you do come in here, because there's foxes that have dug a den underneath, so you could fall in that. I don't know if that den's active, it doesn't look like it is, but nevertheless it is a really significant trip hazard. So the amazing thing is that it's actually really difficult to kill a native tree. Most deciduous trees will resprout when cut, and coppicing is a traditional woodland management technique for sustainably harvesting brushwood. So you can see we're early in the season, it's still spring, the leaves aren't fully out yet, but this young shoot is originating from where the whole tree would have been. The tree, when standing, would have been here, and each of these limbs, there's in fact 5 of them, are growing from the old base of the tree. So this is a naturally regenerating coppice, and it shows how trees can practically live forever. There is a coppice lime in the Westernborough Arboretum, the National Arboretum, which is thought to be 2,000 years old. The reason being, with the trees constantly regenerating, there's really no limit to their life. What does have a limited lifespan is the trunk above ground, but the roots underground can almost go on forever. There are oak trees in this country that are 1,000 years above ground, massive old oak stems. But this one, probably these stems are about 30 to 40 years old. The tree was probably removed when the council took over the site in the 1980s. It's possible the tree fell in the 1987 storm, the Great Storm of 1987, of which I'll talk more later. But the key feature to understand is that trees can go on despite catastrophic damage. And this is a wonderful example. So this tree would have been planted as part of the Loddiges planting in 1840. These individual stems may only be about 40 years old, but the original tree is older. Okay, so this is the other lime tree that dates from the Loddiges Arboretum. This is a huge, magnificent, one of the biggest trees on site, common lime. So the significance I was talking about with the lime coppice, this tree is the sister, is the same size, is the same age, not same size, same age as the coppice we looked at. So you can see that trees of similar ages can look very, very different in their physical form. But this one didn't get cut down, didn't blow down in the 87 storm, although it did move. What you'll notice is it's not standing straight up, it's actually leaning. The reason for that is that in the 87 storm, this one shifted its root plate slightly, but it managed to stay upright. It's obviously also been pollarded. It would have been reduced, pollarded probably about 40 years ago, possibly in the 1980s. So you can see at the about 5 metres up, you can see the change between the strong growth of the old tree where you've got the old bark, big thick trunk, and then above you've got young growth, vigorous young growth with slightly lighter coloured bark and smaller poles. So what you've got here is similar to the coppice we looked at, but the coppice is actually higher up. So you've got the young growth on top of the old trunk. And this is an old technique called pollarding. And this was used as a woodland management technique where you wanted to grow wood out of reach of grazing animals, whether that be deer or cattle. You could pollard, you could cut the tree higher so that it couldn't be browsed, so that you would still get the regrowth without it being eaten. That's not why it's been done here. This one's been pollarded for management reasons, and it's enabled this tree to carry on and still be standing 181 years later after it was planted. So the two lime sisters, completely different trees, but completely different growth forms, but identical trees planted at the same time. This is a weeping holly, a variegated weeping holly. Variegation meaning that the leaves have got yellow on them or some other colour other than green. It's often yellow or silver or white, which is associated with a virus which has been deliberately cultivated. So this is another of the original 1840 plantings. It's an amazing old holly tree. The bit I've got my hand on here is a wound where another limb, the same size as this, will have come off. So this tree was twice the size it is now. It's one of the original Loddiges plantings and raises one of the tricky questions about understanding the Loddiges trees at Abney, which is that because Loddiges was the world's leading nursery of the time, and because we're talking about 180 years ago, it's really quite difficult to precisely put together exactly what we've got at Abney sometimes. That's because the names have changed enormously in that 180 years. The taxonomy has changed. In other words, the way in which things are categorised has changed. And some of the listing and some of the understanding of what was planted has been lost. Although there are records such as the George Collison book and the Loddiges catalogues, they're not necessarily complete. And one of the problems with this tree is it doesn't quite fit any of the known existing cultivars. So I've listed this tree as Perry's weeping holly. And so Perry's weeping holly is a weeping holly and it's variegated. And it's also a female. So in other words, it produces seeds. I'm getting heckled by a robin. So this is a weeping tree. You can see the branches weeping down towards me. But because we're in Abney's woodland and it's quite dense and therefore there's quite a lot of shade, this tree is reverting. So it's reverting in terms of the yellow on the leaves is turning green. So it's putting out more green leaves because it needs to photosynthesize more, and green is the colour for photosynthesis. But it's also going up as opposed to weeping down. So it is as it was planted as a cultivar in open space where it had lots of light, it would be quite happy weeping and would be quite happy with its variegated foliage. But now this is turning into a more upright tree with more green colour. All adds to the complexity of trying to give a name to it. So I've called it Perry's weeping holly because Ilex aquifolium argentea marginata pendula, which is the full scientific name of Perry's weeping holly, is the closest I can match it to. But when I've seen examples of Perry's weeping holly at Kew and other arboreta, I'm not 100% sure that is this tree. It is quite possible that this is a different weeping variegated holly, which was either created by Loddiges or another nursery and planted at Abney as part of that 2,500 different species that were planted at Abney, species and cultivars. And so this could be a lost cultivar. This could be a tree which is no longer known, it's not in the modern catalogues, but is nevertheless an existing specimen. And so it would be quite interesting to graft and propagate this tree to preserve it. We probably also need to do some management around this tree to get a little bit more light to it, because obviously as a weeping tree, it struggles to compete with some of the more vigorous sycamore and other trees. And that's one of the complexities of managing this site, knowing what the different management regimes are required for different trees and different aspects of the ecology on site. But for now, we'll say it's Perry's Weeping Holly, and it's a magnificent remnant of the Loddiges Arboretum. So here we are at another amazing old Abney tree. This is a Corsican pine, Pinus nigra maritima. So this is one of the tallest trees in Abney. Like the swamp cypress, it's a conifer, but this one is an evergreen conifer. It's a pine, probably 25 metres tall. We're getting on for that anyway. One of the original plantings. It's just one of the most significant trees you can find in Abney, just because of its size and because it's a lovely old conifer. It's got plenty of years left in it. Although you'll notice a lot of dead branches low down, that's actually just typical of old tall trees, because as they grow, they shade themselves. So you get a gradual dieback in the lower crown as the crown goes taller and higher. And that's typical of the apical growth that you get on conifers. However, I'm going to contrast this tree, which is very tall, very apical, very straight up, with the next tree, which is also a Corsican pine, but of a very different shape. So this is the other Corsican pine. Same tree, but completely different shape. And this can be one of the confusing things when you're trying to identify trees. If the tree looks very, very different, you assume it's not the same as one that you know. So this is actually a Corsican pine. It's got the same needles, it's got the same cones, but it's been pruned into a form that makes it look very different. And it's very unusual to get a Corsican pine of this sort of shape. I sometimes call this the pyramid tree, because there's a branch going that way, a branch going that way, and it almost forms a pyramid in its crown. It's again one of the trees that struggles slightly in the ash woodland at the back here. So we've got a lot of young ash trees growing up. They're very vigorous and they can go much taller because this tree isn't in its apical form. The one we looked at a moment ago can easily pop its head out the top of the ash woodland, whereas this one is struggling to compete because its lower branches, which have been formed to create this very interesting shape, are being shaded out. And we have done periodic pruning to prune back some of the ash to get more light. One of the things to know about most pines is that pines are not shade tolerant. They're very light demanding, and generally speaking, a pine tree is going to want full sun. So where this tree is being shaded low down in its crown, that part of the tree is dying. Did find an interesting fungus on this one this year. So that's one of the consequences of old trees which have dysfunctional wood in them. You do get interesting wood decay fungi. So new species to Abney I found earlier this year. But we're not doing fungi today, we're doing old Loddiges trees, and this is one of them. So this is another amazing old Loddiges tree. This is the spotted thorn, otherwise known in the United States and Canada as a white haw. So a hawthorn, which bears haws. So white haw or spotted thorn. It's called spotted thorn because the fruit, the haws, have little spots on them. And there'll be a close-up of one for you to see that. Amazing old tree, completely hollow on the inside. And it illustrates the point that the inside of a tree has very little functional value for the tree. It has a role in terms of structural stability, but all the physiology, all the growing bits of the tree are on the outside, just underneath the bark. And you've got these young shoots coming up, lots of foliage elsewhere. So although the entire centre of the tree is hollow, it doesn't matter. The only issue is whether or not it's structurally sound and whether or not we need to do some work to keep it upright. But as far as the physiology of the tree is concerned, it's completely happy. Spotted thorn, Crataegus punctata, definitely one of the Loddiges plantings. Really, really old tree, big for a hawthorn. I mean, look at the size of that for a hawthorn. It's a massive tree. Again, suffering a little bit from the shade. We could probably do with getting a bit more light down to this tree, but this would have been planted by Loddiges in 1840. It's one of the only surviving hawthorns. They would have planted a whole range of hawthorns, and there are other hawthorns on site which are the offspring, the seedlings of the trees that were planted, and there's some very unusual trees on site. So variable leaved hawthorn, Crataegus heterophylla occurs on site. It's one of the only sites in the UK where Crataegus heterophylla, or variable-leaved hawthorn, is naturalised. Comes from the Caucasus. You could call it Caucasian hawthorn. There's loads of different hawthorn species. I think there's about 300 in the United States and Mexico alone. This is one of the ones from the north of the United States, near the Canadian border, but it seems quite happy in the London climate. Crataegus punctata, another great Abney tree. The reason this tree is completely hollow is because its neighbour, which is an English oak, and we'll look at that in a moment, lost a huge limb in the 1987 storm. So the huge storm in 1987 felled millions of trees across the southeast of England, knocked a big limb off the oak next to it. That limb clobbered this tree, knocking the whole top of the tree off. Effectively, the oak pollarded the thorn, knocked the whole top of the tree off, and as a result created a wound, and that's why this tree's hollow. So there's an interrelationship between the different trees on site. You could say it's not always constructive, but actually this tree survived getting clobbered and it's still going strong. So this is the English oak, the only mature English oak at Abney, and at 181 years this is still a youngster. English oak can easily live 300, 400, 500 years. There are plenty of 600, 700, 800-year-old oaks in the UK, and there are 1,000-year-old oaks, Saxon oaks. So oak is a very long-lived species and can live a very long time. This one, part of the original Loddiges planting, straightforward Quercus robur, Quercus peduncular oak, English oak, lovely specimen. And as I was talking about the spotted thorn, this is the wound where in 1987 a big limb came off and fell on top of the spotted thorn just over the way. A lovely tree, twisting, turning. It's really, really gorgeous tree, but particularly important for wildlife. Oak is a wonderful habitat for many, many species. It's a keystone species supporting lots and lots of other species. And this tree is only going to get better in terms of its value for wildlife, because as it ages and more associations are made between this tree and particularly fungi, more complex ecology develops, wood decay and other elements. But today we're talking about Loddiges. This is one of the original Loddiges tree, the only English oak, the only native oak that survives from the Loddiges planting. But next we're going to go and see some really unusual oak trees that come from the Loddiges planting. Okay, so here we are in the Loddiges Oak Grove in Abney Park Cemetery. This is an amazing collection of old oak trees of extraordinary rarity. The taxonomy and nomenclature of these trees is quite complicated. So hold on to your hats. We're going on a journey into taxonomy, nomenclature and hybrid oaks. Taxonomy, the systematics, the way in which trees or species are categorised, how we determine how they're related to each other. In other words, how us as human beings understand the natural world by putting it into some sort of system. Though the system that we use is the Linnaean system of binomial names meaning a genus and a species. So if you were talking about English oak, the genus is Quercus, the species is robur. Quercus robur is English or peduncular oak. Here, it's going to get a lot more complicated than that with these oaks, because these are hybrids. So nomenclature is just the word that we use. It's a word from Russian, which means the way in which we name natural things. So one of the complications of trying to name these things is not only are they rare, but they were planted by Loddiges 181 years ago, and 181 years ago all the nomenclature, all the names and some of the taxonomy was completely different. So I've now got to try and translate this stuff into something that makes sense. So we have 6 surviving oak trees, all of which are hybrids between Turkey oak and cork oak. You'll notice that the tree behind me has quite corky bark. So it inherits that characteristic from Quercus subur, the cork oak, native to Portugal and Spain. It's a hybrid between the cork oak and the Turkey oak, Quercus ceris, which, as the name suggests, is native to Turkey, but also has a very, very broad range. And the two species, Turkey oak and cork oak, both occur in Italy and southern France. And where they occur together, you get naturally occurring hybrids between the two. They, at least until very recently, were known as Quercus cross hispanica. So the cross signifies that it's a hybrid. Hispanica is the specific name. We're now supposed to change that name to crenata, but we're just going to skip that because most people know these as Quercus hispanica, and it's complicated enough. So if you want to be really, really precise, this is Quercus cross crenata, but let's stick with Quercus hispanica for now. Quercus hispanica is the species name for hybrids between Turkey oak and cork oak. But we've got cultivars of that hybrid. In other words, we've got deliberately created hybrids which have been cultivated vegetatively as clones. So in other words, grafted, and they are unique. Here we have Quercus hispanica heterophylla, variable-leaved Luckham oak. Luckham oak. So Luckham oak is what we call the cultivated forms of hybrid between Turkey oak and cork oak. I hope you're staying with me here. We've got a bit of a way to go yet. So the reason they're called Luckham oaks is because in a nursery in Exeter, run by a chap called William Luckham, he noticed that when he planted a Turkey oak next to a cork oak, a tree that grew up between the two looked like it had characteristics of both, and he called it Luckham oak. So in terms of common names, the hybrid between Turkey oak and common oak is generally known as Luckham oak. However, this is variable-leaved Luckham oak because it isn't that original clone, that original hybrid. There are William Luckham oaks, clones of that original tree that was developed at grew at the Luckham nursery. But we haven't got one of those. There's one at Kew and there's a massive one at Fear Park in Exmouth. But what we're talking about is the other cultivars of the same hybrid. So, variable-leaved Luckham oak, Quercus hispanica heterophylla. This is very, very rare. Kew doesn't have one of these, or rather, they may now have a small one, which they have taken from a cutting from this tree. They've grafted a cutting from this tree, and there is one, I believe, growing at Kew now, maybe in their nursery somewhere. Likewise, Hilliers, another of the big nurseries, have got one. Mark Lane from Buckingham Palace Gardens came and took cuttings from this tree about 10 years ago. I've not found where those trees are growing yet, but I believe one is growing at Hilliers Nursery and another is growing at Kew. But Quercus hispanica heterophylla, variable-leaved Luckham oak, is very, very rare. We are amazingly privileged to have this tree at Abney. It is a fantastic tree. It was identified by a woman called Eleanor Wilshaw, who did a lot of work on the oaks at Abney, and she even did some DNA testing with some support from Kew Gardens. The trouble with DNA testing, it's brilliant and it does tell you what you've got if there is data to compare. You can DNA test something, and if the something that you're testing is unique, the DNA isn't going to tell you anything because there's nothing to compare it with. So there isn't DNA data on Quercus crenata heterophylla, Quercus hispanica heterophylla, variable-leaved Luckham oak, but there is data on Fulham oak. So the Fulham oak is another Turkey oak, cork oak hybrid. This one believed to have been grown at a nursery in Fulham, hence Fulham oak. So Fulham oak, Quercus hispanica fulhamensis. So it makes a little bit of sense. The terminology isn't too bad. So that one, again, it's a rare tree. It's not as rare as this one, but it is a rare tree. There are, I think there's a Fulham at Kew. There's a Fulham oak in Victoria Park, but they're not very common. What you'll notice with both of these trees is they both have quite corky bark, which they're inheriting from their cork oak parent. They also are slightly pendulous. They weep slightly. And again, that probably comes from the cork oak genes. All of these hybrids, all of the Luckham oak hybrids, all of the crosses between Turkey oak and cork oak are sub-evergreen. They're not quite evergreen, but they're a bit evergreen. In other words, they tend to hold their leaves through mild winters, but will lose their leaves in hard winters in the UK. And that, again, is characteristics inherited from both parents, because cork oak is evergreen in the UK, Turkey oak is not evergreen in the UK, and you cross the two and you get somewhere in between. So, Fulham oak, variable-leaved Luckham oak. I don't know if you can see the tree to my right, but there is another of these hybrids, and that tree we don't have a name for. It was DNA tested and it didn't come back with any reasonable data. So, this is the story of Abney. We've got amazingly rare cultivars which were created by the Loddiges nursery. And because they were created by such an outstanding leading nursery of the time, no one else had them. And once the Loddiges nursery closed in about 1853, I think the Loddiges nursery closed, some of these cultivars went out of cultivation. So as a result, they don't have common names now, or even scientific names, such that we can actually give proper names to them. So the names that I've just given you, Quercus hispanica heterophylla and Quercus hispanica fulhamensis, are the modern names. If you look back in the Collison records of what was planted at Abney, or in the Loddiges catalogue from 1823 or 1836, you won't find those names, because they were then known under different names. Generally Quercus ceres cultivars. They were thought to be, they were known to be hybrids, but they were generally listed under Quercus ceres. This is getting really complicated, and I'm sorry, but this is Abney for you. Abney has got amazing trees, and there's more to come. So, we've done 3 of the hybrid oaks, 3 of the Turkey cork oak hybrids. We've now got 3 more. The tree I'm standing in, the big tree over there, and the one in the background. The first 3 we looked at are cork oak, Turkey oak hybrids, which carry more characteristics of cork oak than they do Turkey oak. Hence, they all have corky bark. So, the Fulham oak, the variable-leaved Luckham oak, and the tree with no name have all got fairly corky bark, so we know that's inherited from Quercus suber cork oak. These 3 don't have corky bark. They're bigger trees, they're taller, they're slightly greyer in the colour of their bark, and they're slightly less evergreen. So these are all hybrids which carry more characteristics of the Turkey oak. Now, we think this one is Quercus hispanica ragnal, R-A-G-N-A-L, a rare and almost unknown cultivar, which is in the old records, but wasn't recorded as a known cultivar for a long time. It is now still recognised, and this, we believe, is a ragnal oak. It is probably a back cross. So, you've got your cross between your Turkey oak and your cork oak to give you Quercus hispanica. If you then cross Quercus hispanica with one of the parent trees, in this case Turkey oak, Quercus ceres, you get a back cross. And so the back cross has more characteristics of one parent than the other, because it's inherited those from the back cross. So in other words, it's got a bit more Turkey oak in it. So this is probably a back cross. We don't know really what the other 2 trees are. The complication, if it isn't complicated enough, is that these trees were also formatively pruned. In other words, they were pruned to give their shape that they now have. So the tree in front of me has a very broad open crown. That was almost certainly cut when it was young at about 5 metres to create a pollarded effect. In other words, a crown that branches at about 5 metres high. So you get this huge open crown. Magnificent tree. The tree I'm standing in has got this huge gaping wound where I'm standing, because in the 1987 storm, this tree split in half. And the reason it split in half was because it had two limbs. It was growing like this. It had been cut very low down, effectively coppiced, and it grew with two enormous great limbs. That's not a very sound engineering form, not a very sound structural form. So when the hurricane of 87 hit, the limb in this direction fell off and landed here. Hence this massive great wound. The tree is still going strong, but as a result of this formative pruning, the trees don't necessarily look exactly as you might expect for the particular cultivar that you think it is, and we don't really know what it is. So, Ragnall oak, these two trees, again, currently have no name. The DNA testing was inconclusive. There was some suggestion that the big tree over there might have been a Fulham oak, but that doesn't really make much sense because it doesn't have corky bark, it's not weeping, it's not sub-evergreen, so it doesn't really fit with being a Fulham oak. So this is the problem with DNA testing, where you don't have much data to go on. I suspect this is a unique cultivar. There may be no other trees of this type anywhere in the world, likewise possibly with the one behind, and they are different cultivars which were created by Loddiges in 1840 and have gone out of circulation. There are a few names which are possibilities. There's Quercus hispanica canna major, Quercus hispanica canna minor. There are various other cultivars which were created by the Luckham nursery in Exeter, but they don't really fit either. Crispa, Suberosa and Incisor are all known cultivars, but they don't really fit here. So when I was researching these trees and trying to fit these trees into the modern texts, the modern books which describe different cultivars, your tree ID books, it didn't work because these trees aren't in the books, which is quite exciting. It was desperately frustrating at the time, but it's nevertheless very exciting. Until I read the Collison book, which purports to list everything that was planted at Abney. And if you read Collison, it's written in the Victorian period, so it's way out of date in terms of its nomenclature and even its taxonomy. I hope you can hear me over the sound of the parakeet. So in Collison lists Quercus luccumbina canis vars 1 to 21. So in other words, 21 different varieties of Luckham oak. And that is the explanation for the problem here. Loddiges planted 21 different types of Luckham oak. Most of those are no longer known, and the trees that we are trying to name date from that planting, are included within that general description of 21 varieties of Luckham oak. But we can't now give them current names because we never knew what their names were in the first place. So you can have a stab at it. This one has fairly broad leaves. We could call this Quercus hispanica latifolia. Latifolia meaning broad-leaved. It could be the broad-leaved Luckham oak. The one behind, very grey bark, not a particularly vigorous tree considering it's 181 years old. That could be canna minor. It's just possible. That is the Loddiges creation, canna minor. Or you might call it Quercus hispanica canis, just because canis is Latin for grey and it's got grey bark. So, you know, there are ways in which we could name these trees, but really without an awful lot more research and some more authority, those names aren't going to stick. But what I have done, I hope, is explain to you why Loddiges was such an amazing nursery and why Abney is such an amazing place for trees, because no one else has got these trees because they were created by Loddiges, planted by Loddiges, and then Loddiges went out of business. So big thumbs up to Abney. Amazing Arboretum trees, possibly don't occur anywhere else in the world. So just a little bit about the wood decay on this tree, because as you can see, it's got a huge open cavity on it. And as I was saying, the tree split apart in the 1987 storm. Almost half the tree fell off. And 1987 was a long time ago. What was that, 44 years ago? But the tree's still here. Was it 34 years ago? The tree's still here. And although there is a bracket fungus here, great elm bracket, or Rigidiporus ulmarius, to give it its proper name. And there is some wood decay. The tree is incredibly healthy and doing really well because, as discussed before in relation to the Crataegus punctata, the spotted thorn, all the living stuff is on the outside of the tree, and so it's all doing really well. And then what you can notice, if you look at this bracket fungus, the bracket fungus is actually the thing that's on its way out. It grew and grew and grew, and now it's getting smaller and smaller as the tree compartmentalizes the decay and isolates the fungus within the tree, so that the fungus is no longer able to feed so heavily within the tree, and the fruiting body is beginning to shrink. So although it's not a precise science, the size of a fruiting body and the rate at which it grows doesn't necessarily indicate the degree to which the fungus is operating inside the tree. There is logically usually a correlation between the speed of growth of the fungus and the amount of decay going on inside the tree. But even if you've got a fast-growing bracket fungus, that doesn't mean that your tree's going to fall over, because the tree is constantly compensating for the loss of the wood. So it's a very complex process. But massive wound wood being developed here. This is where the tree is securing itself. It's not going to be able to close that cavity, but what it is doing is putting on lots of wood to give itself the strength to withstand further winds. Another hybrid oak, but don't worry, it's not as complicated as the Luckham oaks. This is Turner's oak, or strictly speaking, false Turner's oak. This is a hybrid between English oak and holly oak, or holm oak. So Quercus ilex, holm oak or holly oak, and English oak or peduncular oak, Quercus robur. So it's a hybrid between the evergreen holm oak and the native deciduous English oak. As a result, it has leaves which are sub-evergreen. It loses its leaves around about now, really, so it will never go completely bare, but it will lose its leaves in late spring, and it's got the characteristics of both parents. This one is a particularly tall and upright looking tree because it was pollarded when the council took over the site about 40 years ago, and so it's gone straight up because of the competition from the ash trees around it. It would otherwise be a much more open tree. There are two known cultivars of English oak and holm oak. There is the true Turner's oak, Quercus cross Turneri Spencer Turner, which is the original cross which was made by a chap called Spencer Turner. And then there is another cross which was made slightly later. That's this one. This is Quercus cross pseudo Turneri. And I'm not sure what the specific epithet or the cultivar epithet is. It's known as a false Turner's oak, so Quercus cross pseudo Turneri. It may be sound a little bit unnecessary to go into the great detail of if it's a hybrid between the two of the same species, why distinguish, but they have slightly different characteristics. And the nature of cultivating plants is that you cultivate them for their particular characteristics. And as we've seen with the Luckham oaks, some of them have very corky bark, some of them are very weeping, and some of them are very different. So it's useful to have a very specific name for each cultivar. So this is the false Turner's oak, Quercus cross pseudo Turneri. And that is the end of the tour of Abney's rare old Loddiges trees. I've taken you around pretty much all of the old trees. There were one or two others that we didn't manage to get to, but these are the bulk of the surviving trees from the Loddiges Arboretum. And as you've seen, they are amazingly rare old trees in many respects. Some of them in fantastic health, and it makes Abney one of the go-to places to see really, really rare trees. As I've said before, in 1840, Abney was more diverse and had more different cultivars than even Kew Gardens at that time. It's not the case now, but it's still got some of the remnants that Kew doesn't have. So I hope you enjoyed our tour of the Loddiges trees of Abney Park Cemetery. I'm Russell Miller. I'm a local ecologist, a local arboriculturalist. I do lots of stuff with trees, bees, insects, deadwood, fungi, the whole works. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'm Tree Russ on Twitter. I'm Russell Miller 495 on Instagram. I help run Tree Musketeers, and I do loads of stuff. Hopefully I'll see you online somewhere, or even better, maybe in Abney for a walk in person in the summer. Thanks for watching.
Thanks very much, everyone. Feel free to unmute yourself. Sorry about the it's a bit laggy to begin with. Hopefully it cleared up a little bit. And I suppose we will start our Q&A session. So feel free to unmute yourself. And we have our first question from Roger Spear. For the biologically challenged, how does the hybridity happen? I.e., what happens to the acorn to lead to hybridity?
Okay, can you hear me? So apologies for the video quality there. It's a tricky subject, and with a jerky video, that probably didn't make it any easier. So well done to those of you who are still with us. Okay, how do you turn an acorn into a hybrid? Well, it comes before the acorn is an acorn. It's what's going on with the flowers. So the original Luckham oak developed at the Luckham nursery in Exeter. You had a turkey oak growing next to a cork oak, and the two just cross-pollinated each other naturally by wind. Oaks are largely pollinated by wind. Oaks actually have catkins that are very rarely seen because they come out with the leaves. Pollen from either the cork oak pollinated a female flower on the turkey oak, or vice versa. And the acorn, therefore, when the acorn developed, it was already hybridized. It had its hybrid genes. So that's how hybridization happens, basically cross-pollination.
Wonderful. The next question is from Anna, and it's asking, are there nurseries doing similar work to Loddiges these days, sort of cross-pollination, experimenting with trees? And if not, do you have any theories as to why?
Yeah, so I mean, the people are always trying to create new things. I mean, you've got people creating new flowers, new trees, new roses. So there's a constant process of hybridizing. Orchids, a lot of people work on. I think possibly the huge confusion around Luckham oaks, and if you look in any of the books, there is a lot of confusion around them. It's probably put people off doing very much with cork oak, turkey oak hybrids, because it's quite hard when you're working in an area which is so unclear to take it forward. So I'm not sure anyone is actually propagating turkey oak, cork oak hybrids, but certainly there are new hybrid trees and new hybrid cultivars coming out all the time. And the particular areas of research are often around things like street trees. So streets are a very difficult environment in which to grow trees. You really want in a street something that goes straight up. It doesn't get too wide, doesn't get in the way, doesn't fall apart, doesn't produce fruit because that will cause a mess on the pavement, looks really pretty, can tolerate huge temperature variations. And so there's lots of criteria which make being a street tree very difficult. So there are loads of street tree cultivars constantly being cultivated by nurseries. One thing I would say, if you're thinking of buying a cultivated tree, buy one that was cultivated a few years ago. Don't buy a brand new one, because when you do buy a brand new one, you buy what they say it's going to do, and it isn't necessarily going to do what they say it's going to do because they haven't seen it, because it hasn't been around long enough. So there is a hybrid of, or a cultivar of hornbeam. Hornbeam is a native tree, Carpinus speculus. And there was a fastigiate form of hornbeam, in other words, a very upright form of hornbeam developed about 30 years ago called Carpinus speculus pyramidalis. Well, if you know Clissold Park, there are some very lollipop-shaped hornbeams in Clissold Park where they're kind of giant balls on a trunk. And the trouble with Carpinus speculus pyramidalis is, although it's very upright when it's young, as it matures, it turns into this giant kind of football and gets very wide. So if you're picking a tree for your garden or a particular place because you want it to be nice and upright, pick a cultivar that was done a few years ago to make sure that it's going to do what they think it's going to do. Very long-winded answer, sorry about that. Any more questions?
Yes, we have loads coming in. So the next is from Nina, a self-proclaimed fungi nerd, and she's asking, are there any fungi which pop up in Abney only because of their rare or old trees?
That's probably over my head, that one. My guess would be no, because the rare old cultivars are either unnatural in the sense that they don't occur naturally, and so there won't have been symbiotic or mycorrhizal relationships developed with fungi with them, or they're from other places in the world. And so, for example, Quercus hispanica is a native hybrid of northern France and southern Italy. But whether you'd get a mycorrhizal fungi particularly associated with that isn't otherwise associated with one of its parents, it seems a bit unlikely to me. But I have to confess, I can't give a definitive answer to that. Gina Rackley is the expert on fungi at Abney, and she's got a fantastic website. If you want to look at Abney fungi, big up to all the fungi nerds out there. It's great to have fungi nerds. Have a look at Gina Rackley's Abney fungi website. That will tell you about as much as anyone's going to tell you about fungi at Abney.
Wonderful. Then Julio has asked that he's noticed some ivy growing around the oaks. Is that a good thing?
Generally speaking, ivy growing around the oaks is a good thing, in the sense that ivy is a good plant in its own right, provides lots of winter cover. It flowers very late in the season if it's in sunlight, and so it provides very late pollen and nectar. So the issue with ivy on trees only becomes a problem if you've got a small tree like a hawthorn or an apple, where the ivy can get right into the top of the tree and reduce its ability to photosynthesize. With an oak tree, that's rarely a problem. It can be. You do get ivy going way up into big oak trees. And sometimes, yes, it is worth clearing them. I did advise Woodbury Wetlands to take some of the ivy off, particularly their hawthorns. But generally speaking, you want to keep ivy. And the ideal is, if it is getting too much, is to put it on a kind of coppice rotation where you cut it off and then you let it regrow. There is a slight risk where you've got a crown which is very full of ivy. It might cause the tree to blow over, partly because ivy is evergreen, and so the wind sail in winter is much greater than it would be otherwise. And also because if it's reducing the tree's ability to photosynthesize, there may be a weakness in the root system. But providing the ivy isn't too high up in the tree and isn't reducing the tree's ability to photosynthesize, ivy is not a problem.
Wonderful. And next we have Trisha, who's asked if you can repeat the name of the book you referred to on tree types.
Which book?
It's the is it the Collinson one, or the tree types in Abney, or?
Okay, so I'll go through whichever I can remember. So there is the historic books. There's a Collison's book. I can't remember what it's called. It's something like Internments at Abney. Yeah, can't remember what it's called. Old books in the kind of early Victorian period used to have titles which were about a paragraph long. So it's probably got quite a long title. But if you Google George Collison, Abney Park Cemetery trees, I think you'll find it. I say you'll find it. You won't find the book. The only copy I've ever found is in Hackney archives. There may be rare copies online, but I haven't found one. Likewise, Loddiges' catalogue of 1836, which is the last one prior to Abney being planted. I've never seen a copy of that either. The 1824, something like that one, is available online. But yeah, a lot of these books are very, very difficult to get hold of. I think you might even have to go to somewhere like the Guildhall, one of the London libraries, to find them. I think they were the ones I mentioned, but do ask again if I didn't.
Wonderful. Helen has asked, are any of the chestnuts in Abney original Loddiges plantings?
Oh, good question. Yeah, probably not. I suspect most of the chestnuts at Abney, and we're talking horse chestnuts, are 1890 plantings. So from what we believe, the original Loddiges planting of 1840, quite a lot of it was taken out in the late Victorian period, around about 1890, because they were running out of burial space. So you imagine you've got this fantastic arboretum planted with 2,500 different species, but you're trying to run a business which involves burying people, and your trees kind of just take up too much space. So what we fear happened was quite a lot of the trees got felled to create new space for burials. And at that time, they then replanted trees which were obviously very small when they planted them. And we suspect that the poplars and the chestnuts, the aesculus, were planted in 1890 in a sort of second series of planting.
Cool. So then Simon has asked, he says that, first of all, brilliant talk. And then says he's been reading some grim stuff about the environment. And have you seen the decrease of pollinators? And is it affecting Abney and its trees?
Yeah, so another thing I do is kind of is stuff on pollinators, and it's really hard because there is data where you've got kind of really good scientific studies. So if you look at the State of Nature Report 2019, that gives the latest kind of really hard scientific data on decline in various species, including pollinators. But the really tricky thing is actually evidencing very specific decline, because unless you're doing a lot of very complex recording, it's very hard to prove with data. My personal observations are that I think the numbers of flying insects are reduced year on year. And I mean, I'm often looking not so much at the trees, but if you look at floral rich areas anywhere, I mean, look at kind of a slow bush in flower, or apple trees in flower. If you're near a honeybee hive, it might be buzzing, but generally speaking, what I've noticed is there are relatively few pollinators given the amount of forage that there is available. So yes, I think there's a massive decline in pollinators. And I think it's very complex. I don't think we fully understand it. I think it's got to do with biodiversity, habitat loss, but it's also got to do with the number of chemicals that there are in the environment. And we just don't know exactly what's going on. Dave Goulson's done a lot of really good research on neonicotinoids and other kind of problematic chemicals for pollinators. But it's so complicated because, who knows if there's a chemical in washing up liquid that, seeps into the environment somewhere and causes an effect. A lot of these chemical processes we don't fully understand. And all we really know is kind of anecdotally that there are less insects around than there used to be. And there's that anecdotal story that, if you're my sort of age and when you grew up and you were driving anywhere in your parents' car, when you got out of the car, if you'd been any distance, the windscreen or the number plate would be covered in insects. You do that now and you've got to go a hell of a long way before you're going to get very many insects on your number plate or your windscreen. So yes, there's definitely a decline, but evidencing it, yeah, tricky.
So another question, are there any particular birds that like particular trees, and would that be a part of future planning of trees?
Generally speaking, birds in the UK are not terribly fussy. So woodpeckers, great spotted woodpeckers, which are plentiful in Abney, they tend to like ash because it's quite good for banging holes in and kind of making your nest in. But they're not that fussy. They'll nest in pretty much anything if there's a suitable rotting hole that they can develop. There are hummingbirds in tropical areas which are very tree specific, but in the UK, I can't think of a tree bird specific relationship. The owls in Abney tend to nest in poplars because they've got big holes in them, but if the oaks had big holes in them, they'd nest in the oaks. So no, to my knowledge, not a huge great of relationship. The little birds like the firecrests, one of the rarer birds we get at Abney, they tend to like conifers. They tend to like lots of dense cover in winter. But again, it's more the cover that they're after than the specific species.
Wonderful. Next question. I was curious to know if the presence of these trees is connected to the appointment of Abney as a garden of historic interest from an ecological point of view.
Okay, so let me just read that question, get my head around it. So the designation of Abney as an historic garden is to do with its landscaping and its association with Loddiges. So it is a formal national designation associated with its historic significance. And yes, Abney's old trees form part of that, the reasoning behind that. What's interesting is that no one really knows or understands it enough to really put that detail into the designation. So, for example, now that we're entering into the delivery phase of the National Lottery Heritage Fund project, I sat on the board that was developing that project. And it was me who piped up and said, oh, well, we ought to keep the hollies at the front gate in Stamford Hill because they were planted by Loddiges. And no one else knew that. And you often get these projects where you have to do significant work because you've got to build a new building, you've got to build a new visitor centre, and something has to go. And those hollies might well have gone if I hadn't known that they were historically significant, because historic England, although they do value and recognise the site as a garden cemetery and of historic significance, they didn't know those hollies were there and they didn't know their significance. So there's a lot of kind of complexity to designations, and very often those designations don't have the full detail that can be appreciated when you really know a site very well.
Next one is, could you please discuss how the hybridization process is managed, and thinking about how the introduction of hybridized species can alter an existing ecology?
Okay, so introducing a hybrid species probably isn't going to make much difference to ecology, because most hybrids are infertile. Not all hybrids know that they're infertile, and so the particular Quercus hispanica isn't infertile, and it does produce some seed. But generally speaking, the process of hybridization itself tends to produce something of very limited fertility. And the logic of that being that if the hybrid was fertile, it wouldn't be a hybrid, it would be a species, because a species is something that can reproduce itself. So, all of this has lots of caveats, because all of this is human interpretation placed on nature, and nature does what it likes. We just try and work out what's going on. And sometimes we're better at it and sometimes not. So in terms of hybridization, the significance in terms of the ecology is limited by the fact that a hybrid will have relatively little reproductive capability. So the pollen and the seeds from hybrids tend to be quite weak. The problems associated with introduction of non-native species are well known, whether you're talking about cane toads or Himalayan balsam or whatever. There is a great significance to translocating something from outside of its known environment to another environment where it may or may not have a niche that it can sit in, or it may just take over. But I mean, humans are probably an example of that as well. So moving on.
So that is all the questions we have. Oh wait, one just came in. All these tree roots are presumably why there are so many wonky tombstones.
No, that's a common misconception. Wonky tombstones are because coffins are hollow boxes of wood, and when you stick it in the ground, after a certain amount of time, that hollow box is going to disintegrate, and your hollow is going to be unsupported. So generally speaking, gravestones that are wonky are to do with cavities underneath the grave, because you've got a big lump of heavy stone on top of a cavity. So no, it's not the tree's fault for the wonky graves. It's the fact that the dead people aren't there anymore, and the coffins aren't there anymore.
Another one's just come in. What was the new fungus found this year on the pyramid pruned Corsican pine?
Okay, that is quite specific.
Oh, your volume, it's a bit hard to hear you.
Hello? Is that
yeah,
better?
all good.
Yeah. So it's one of what used to be called Phalinus species. I think it's now called Fomitiporia, and I think it was Fomitiporia ferus. I'll check that, and I can post that if people want to know. So it's one of the resupinate fungi. So one of the fungi that doesn't form brackets, but forms a crust. And it was a crust on the underside of the tree, on the underside of a dead branch. And yeah, I think I got it to Fomitiporia ferus. but there are a couple in that genus, and I can't remember for definite, but I think that's what it was.
Wonderful. Well, now we have run out of questions. I want to be the first to say thank you very much, Russell. That was an amazingly informative talk. I learned a lot. I think I'm going to have to rewatch it to make sure it all goes in, but it was so good and so entertaining. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone else who has shown up this evening. It's really, really helpful for the trust, and you know, every ticket you buy goes a long way to help us. So thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a nice evening.
I want a tree walk in person sometime. We'll do one in
Yes.
person. Get out and look at some trees.
Very soon we'll be doing walks in Abney Park, and Russell's will be among them. So please keep your eyes posted. Thanks everyone. Have a nice evening.